Welcome to our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold, your program host. You know, it's important that you and I pass on to our children an amazing estate. And that estate is called the public lands. And here in the Billings area, we have in our backyard one of the greatest pieces of public land you can possibly imagine. It goes from the highest place in Montana clear out to South Dakota with grasslands and amazing pieces of country. It's the headwaters of wonderful trout streams and a recreation playground for so many of us. And we want to pass this on to our kids the way we enjoy it today. And thank goodness we've got professional managers who are doing stewardship over that land. And I got one of those really special people with me today, Mary Erickson, the Supervisor of the Custer Gallatin National Forest. Hi, Mary.
Hello.
We used to shake hands, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Maybe even a hug now and then.
Things are a little different.
Things are a little different now. Hey, Mary, where'd you come from? Where'd you grow up?
Okay, that may be the hardest question you asked me today. Let's see. Let's see. I moved around a lot as a kid. My father was a World War II vet, and then came back and went to school on the GI Bill, and then moved around. So I was born in Boise. We lived in Alaska, Utah, Michigan, upstate New York, Wisconsin, and then I moved out and went to forestry school in Oregon.
Well, you've had, so you've been the supervisor of the Custer Gallatin now for what, six?
We're going to say 12 years.
Oh, no,
Yes.
Time flies.
And with the Forest Service this is my 37th year.
No kidding. Where else have you been stationed?
Let's see, I went to forestry school in Oregon and then started my career with the Forest Service in Oregon on the Wainema National Forest that was then combined into the Fremont Wainema National Forest. Spent a lot of years in Oregon, loved it there. Then I moved to the Fish Lake National Forest in central Utah. Spent about 7 years on the Fish Lake as the forest supervisor, and then I came up here as the forest supervisor on the Gallatin. Came in December of 2007.
My gosh.
About a year later, we were going through some changes as an agency and ended up as the forest supervisor for the Custer Gallatin as those forests merged and combined. The combination actually becoming official on the books in 2014.
And that is a huge chunk of public land, is it not? How long does it take you to drive from one end of the forest to the other?
Well, we say from the Ranger District in West Yellowstone to the Ranger District in Camp Crook, South Dakota, probably about 8 hours.
No, my goodness. And over 3 million acres.
A little over 3 million.
Yeah. And it is quite a variety of cultures, too. You butt up against 2 Indian reservations, Yellowstone National Park.
Well, I don't know exactly what the metric is, but we always brag that we think we're one of the most diverse forests in the National Forest System, and that diversity being ecological diversity and community diversity from east to west. You have the small communities, Camp Crook, South Dakota, Buffalo, South Dakota, Ekalaka, Montana, very different small rural communities, different economies, to Bozeman or Big Sky, Red Lodge, and everything in between.
Yes, I mean your clientele in Bozeman might have a different discussion than the group at Ekalaka.
They might.
Yeah, all very good people. All of them very, very interested in how their national forest is managed.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with that spectrum? This is a tough question, Mary. How do you deal with that spectrum of different opinions? All of them valid. All of them engaged and interested.
Yeah, well, that is a difficult question. What I would say is, national forest lands are for everyone. They're for people who live locally, and they're for everyone across the country. That being said, I think there's a lot of value, I think, in the model that the Forest Service has, which is still a model of, you have a national forest, and then you have ranger districts. And ranger districts, really, for so many people, that's the face of the Forest Service.
Yeah.
And where the ranger district is located in a community, then that's the heart and soul of the Forest Service, and that's that local engagement.
And that's important to keep it that way too, isn't it?
I think it's important to keep it that way.
Yeah, it's good that our on-the-ground rangers have the authority to do stuff, and that's a key thing of success, I think.
Yeah, I was a district ranger for about 12 years with the Forest Service, and I think district rangers would probably say they feel like they don't have as much authority as they had, at the when the Forest Service was created, when the ranger district was king and of their landscape. But I do think there's a lot of value to having that model with the Forest Service, and to keeping as much authority with the district rangers at the local level, because that's really where the work gets done. That's kind of the grassroots of the agency.
Mary, you're just getting completed of a overall management plan for the Custer Gallatin National Forest. I would like to chat with you a little bit about that. And I've been involved in it some because I've been paying attention to it. Public involvement has been a big thing for you guys, hasn't it?
It has.
In that plan.
Well, I'll talk about that a little bit. So I often in public meetings started this conversation to say, I started my career with the Forest Service over 36 years ago, and I started my career as an analyst economist on a forest plan revision team. So this is back in the 80s, so I feel like in some ways I've come full circle. But the reason I bring that up is I think about, that was on a planning team in Oregon, and I think about in those days, just being young, out of school, and engaging the public in a revision process. And we would host public meetings, and if you had 10 people show up, that was a crowd. Mm-hmm. And in those days, going back to the 80s again, the 10 people that showed up were representing a very small cross-section of who uses the National Forest. Mm-hmm. And then I think about later in my career, we were working on forest plan revision in central Utah. And I think about there many more people showing up, and then moving here and thinking about the diversity of communities and landscapes and how many people participated. And on one hand, it's unwieldy and challenging to have that much, that level of diverse opinion, that level of interest, but it's a fantastic thing because it means that people get it. They understand how important public lands are now, and I feel like that level of involvement in this place it's a challenge. How you manage that, but it's also a blessing for us because you can't manage public lands into the future without people caring and being invested.
I can't imagine how many public meetings you've had on this plan that you're doing, and where people really had a chance to get engaged and chat with your specialists and your team people.
I don't know that I have the exact number, but I know that we said that throughout the process there's been well over 100 public meetings, and that's when we would at each step in the process, when we would basically start to go out to the communities that are involved with this national forest, it was about a 3-week process to schedule those meetings and then get on the road and do that. And it was really important for me to be out in each of those communities to really understand how did people think about the national forest closest to their community and what was really on their mind. And so it was a big effort. At the start of the process, we acknowledged that the forest had just been recently merged. You couldn't develop a plan that would have broad-based support without actually getting out and recognizing that things are different in Ekalaka and what people care about is different. And unless we were there talking to people, it really wasn't going to work. And you couldn't run that from Bozeman or Billings alone. You really had to get out.
Mary, I compliment you because you were out there. I mean, here's the top Custer Gallatin supervisor out there talking to the public, engaging, answering questions, deeply engaged. Congratulations to you.
Well, thank you. We learned a lot. It was very important for us as we started forest plan revision to really recognize that the different communities were very different and what people valued was different across the landscape. As we worked through that process, other than bison, probably our number one issue was really how do people think about land designations or land allocations, and what value do they place on that? And one of the things, and I know you talked to Ken about this, was that one of the pieces of plan revision each time, because our old plans are well over 30 years old, they're old. Every time you revise your plans, one of the requirements is to look at those lands with existing wilderness character and then really make recommendations on what to do with those. And that issue, kind of that nugget there, is the one area that generates probably the most comment in plan revision. What really should be the disposition? And the part that I find just maybe worth calling out and is that the value people place on those lands is, people are very passionate, they place a lot of value on those lands. Then what they think you should do about that varies. But the value is what they hold in common. People value the fact that these areas are wildlands, that these areas have a sense of place. Then it just seems to vary based on what do they think you should do with that moving forward. And that was probably our number one issue when you looked at the range of alternatives we had in plan revision, was really around options for recommended wilderness or backcountry from people who felt like, I don't want those restrictions at all because it, will affect my ability to expand, a recreation use that I value or some multiple use aspects of national forest management, to people who felt like the only way to address that was to designate all lands that have wilderness character as recommended wilderness, because they say that's the gold standard. So I would just put that was really our number one issue, is what was the right balancing act there. And where we landed was thinking, again, we had a range of alternatives, and when we thought about it with the team, and the rangers were intimately involved in this, we said, the areas we recommend as wilderness should be those areas that not only currently have that character and are the best of the best, but those areas that we would hope that the agency would not only retain with that existing character, but would advocate through a congressional process as wilderness in the future. So when we thought through that, one of the choices we made, and this was a choice that we were afforded, we did not recommend areas as wilderness in our plan that have a lot of non-conforming uses. We thought about that long and hard and said, in general, we want recommended wilderness to be those areas that if Congress were to take this up, we could actually potentially see designation.
These were tough cuts, weren't they?
They were tough cuts. And then when we thought about backcountry, we said there are some areas that maybe the public comment was very mixed, but people appreciated that sense of place and in general wanted to keep them as they were. But they didn't want those regulatory overlays. And we really called out about 200,000 acres as backcountry across the forest.
That's kind of a new concept too, isn't it?
It was a different concept. The old
actually,
plan,
it's not new, but
maybe not new, but the
different.
old Custer plan had some backcountry areas on the Ashland district that were these low development areas that they didn't have roads. They kind of wanted to almost freeze frame. And then when we got into this planning process, we kept hearing that similar thread. People who said, yes, I value that place. I don't want a whole lot. I don't want roads. I don't want a lot of changes. But I also don't want to have all those existing uses. If there's mountain bikes or if there's a motorized route through it, I don't want to be kicked out of there. And so that was the balancing act, is thinking about recommended wilderness as the best of the best in the places we hope the agency would advocate for designation, and backcountry areas to preserve the wild character of places, but to really allow some of those existing uses to continue in a managed way. The example I would give you on thinking about backcountry is, you think about the Crazy Mountains. Crazy Mountains is a complex landscape. Checkerboard ownership, amazing high peaks, valued by so many people. There were a lot of lands in there that met the technical definition of, lands of wilderness character. But those lands were in this checkerboard pattern. And so when we for the first time actually have a recommended wilderness proposal in the south end of the Crazies. It's a relatively small area, but it's an area that we think really meets those characters and has that value. Then we thought about what's the long-term vision for the Crazies, and we called out on the east side of the Crazies this larger area of backcountry that overlays a lot of that checkerboard.
Is that where the trail issues were?
It is. It is. Well, actually, the trail issues are all over because it's.
I know it's more.
But when we thought about that, we have some people who said, well, that should all be recommended wilderness. And when we thought about it, we said, to push a recommended wilderness overlay right over all this checkerboard private land in the longer term really isn't going to create the conversation we want to have with private landowners. Interestingly enough, those same landowners actually appreciate the non-motorized setting. They appreciate the quiet recreation.
Oh.
They appreciate the fact that it's a great
part
wildlife.
Of what part important to them?
It's very important to them, but if you push the recommended wilderness overlay, that kind of creates some consternations.
Interesting. You mentioned bison.
Bison, yeah.
What's that?
Let's see.
I do know what a bison is.
You know what a bison is. So I guess there's a lot to be said in the world of bison, but we are one of the only national forests in the system that actually has free-roaming wild bison on the national forest. There's some grasslands that have bison, but of course that's part of our adjacency to Yellowstone National Park. We're part of the Interagency Bison Management Plan, and that conversation about how does the Forest Service articulate our vision for bison on the national forest and also recognize all the challenges associated with that. So that was a huge issue. Will generate a lot of objections on that, the balancing act. But what we tried to do in this new plan is be much more affirmative than our previous plans, that we do see the value of bison as native wildlife. We see the value in having bison on the national forest, but we need to do that and think about tolerance for bison with respect for the role that the state plays in that,
Yeah.
and with the respect for the role that tribal partners and other publics have in that. So we tried to balance that and articulate that we certainly have a role, but it's not a role in opposition to the states. It's a role of being a partner and trying to remove cooperation and removing barriers.
Yeah, what a challenge that one is.
And the challenge we have is our old plan was almost silent on bison, and of course the bison management issue has been framed almost as a native wildlife versus domestic livestock. But it's not that simple.
No,
It's not just a diseased domestic livestock issue. It's also a fact that bison are big animals, and there's some of these places there's communities and landscapes that it's going to be hard to get bison roaming through Big Sky.
No, it doesn't fit too well.
Doesn't fit as well.
No. The aspect in your plan about thinking about fire, climate, changes in urbanization coming into the national forest, are those difficult issues for you to deal with?
Well, they're very difficult issues. I mean, how you think about how you just think about population pressure, increases in recreation use, climate change, changes in just use patterns surrounding the national forest, development of private lands, and how you think about the role that national forests play for simply wildlife or wildlife migration with all those other pressures. Yeah, it's a big deal.
The plan is out now. We're through the public involvement part of that plan now, aren't we not? Or where are we, Mary? Explain to me.
That's a great question, because there's actually a bit of confusion out right now. So I think this is a great service. We've been in this process for 4 years. We issued a draft EIS with a range of alternatives, and now we've taken all that comment and really landed on a draft plan. The stage we're at right now is the objection process. So the objection process is not a comment process per se. It's not another round of public input. It's really that chance for the Forest Service has played our hand.
You're saying this is where we're going.
This is where we're going. This is the balancing act we've done based on our specialists, based on all our internal review, based on how we took in all that public comment, what we heard. This is the balancing act we would put forward on how we meet law, policy, and regulation, how we set out a vision for future management. And then we ask people, for those of you who have participated in the process,
You got to have been part of it.
You have to have been part of. You have to have skin in the game.
That makes sense.
Yeah, you have to have participated and submitted comments in one of the official comment periods. So you have to have participated in that, and where you have, either as an individual or an organization, now you take a look at what the Forest Service is putting forth, and you say, where have we gotten it right? Where do you think we've gotten it wrong, or you want to see something different? And then you can go through and file an objection. And in that objection, people need to both articulate the information they have and why they think we got it wrong, and also describe what they think a remedy would be.
So are they objecting to you?
The objections are filed, well, the way I would describe it is, and this objection process is relatively new for the Forest Service. It's not the way it was done in the old days. In the old days, the Forest Service made a decision, right? It was a decision.
Yeah.
And then we said, if you don't like it, you can appeal.
That's right.
But in those days, when you appealed, when the Forest Service addressed all the appeals, you were really in a bind, because I couldn't address your appeal and resolve it without maybe harming someone over here, because the decision was already made.
I see.
And often we had to start over then if you were going to make some changes. With an objection process, people file an objection. The objections are filed with my boss, the regional forester, for the aspects of the plan that are within my authority. And then there's a very particular part of the planning process now called the identification of species of conservation concern. That decision was at the level of the regional forester, and for those people who would file objections on that, they're actually filing the objections to the chief's level.
Oh my gracious, huh?
So those objections are all coming in. The objection period closes on September 8th. We already have a number of objections.
Have you?
Yeah, and again, we don't.
You're not going to talk about that here today, are you?
I won't talk about the substance, but again, we don't take that personally. It's all part of the process. Those objections are yarded up, they get looked at, and then our regional forester comes, and someone from the chief's office comes and really involves those people who file objections and interested parties to look for how do we resolve those.
Quite a process, hasn't it?
It is quite a process. I should probably put out, when we think about all those the timelines and working through the objection process, our goal is to have the new plan in place in spring of 2021.
Okay. 12 years you've been supervisor, Mayor Erickson. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That tenure is important though, isn't it? And it gives you a chance to think about how time has passed and what the future is like. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's a big question.
It is a big question.
I would say, I think about the history of the Forest Service, and there definitely was a time when managers were encouraged to move around more rapidly. And when I reflect on that over my career, I think there's value in being invested in a place, getting to know people, and really caring about the decisions you make and the outcome of those decisions. So I've been here 12 years. It's a big landscape. There's a lot of the forest that I don't know, so I don't.
No, you can't. You can't get to every piece as much as you might want to.
Yeah, but I do think there's value in being in a place and being invested in a place long enough to care about how those decisions are going to play out, not just in 5 years, but in 20 years or 50 years. Maybe this is where you're going with the question, but when I think about the value of this national forest, every national forest has great value. All public lands to me have great value, but this is a pretty special place, and it's a place that's valuable locally, regionally, nationally, and really internationally. And so how we think about the stewarding we do and how we sustain that for generations to come is a real challenge.
Has rollover and staffing changed over the years? Is it more stable? I don't know. It wasn't unstable, I suppose, but you're well-trained people coming in and...
What I would say is I think we have, one of the advantages we have is these are maybe premier locations in the National Forest System.
Yeah, people want to be here.
People want to be here.
Yeah.
People want to be in these communities. The communities have changed. The cost of living has gone up. We've seen that for sure in Bozeman. That it's a fantastic location, but we've also seen in the last few years people declining jobs after they've accepted them when they realized the cost of housing wasn't something they could afford. But yeah, I'd say by and large we certainly have. We have some turnover. We're an aging workforce in the Forest Service.
Oh, yeah.
And just demographically, we probably haven't kept up hiring as many younger people coming into the agency as we did maybe in previous decades. So you think about that turnover, but
is that the case? so you've got an aging agency with not the number of new people coming in the bottom, is that?
Yeah, I think we're getting some. I saw a graphic once that looked at the demographics of the Forest Service, and again, we get pulses of new hiring. I think about when in the early 2000s with the National Fire Plan, there was a big pulse of hiring of fire folks. Right now, much of our hiring is still in that fire arena.
I notice around the state, you've got some fairly substantial fire crews here and there.
Yes.
And specialized ones. It's good. That's a good thing.
It is a great thing.
Yeah.
But if you look at over the last maybe 20, 30 years, most of the new employment in the Forest Service tends to be in the fire workforce. It's just the nature of, it's the nature of what's happening in the West. Longer fire seasons, wildfire is definitely an issue in communities, and the agency has to be prepared. And it's front and center with Congress in terms of our ability to address wildfire in the West.
Yeah, I know the old days. Your 4,000 acre fire would be a huge fire. Yeah. Now 100,000 acres and whole communities being burned up, and it's a big deal.
Yeah, well,
and big responsibility, and then urban interface.
Yeah. That's what the point. I'll just switch back and see if maybe you can. When I looked at a summary of demographics of the Forest Service as an agency, and one of the graphics showed really the agency generally having people who had been hired in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, and then for a long period outside of fire, not a lot of hiring in the agency. I think you're just starting to see that curve turn around as those folks who were hired in the 80s and early 90s are kind of reaching retirement age, and you're starting to see some people come in. But definitely the age distribution in the agency has been a little bit skewed for the last couple decades.
But there's plenty of good, well-trained people coming out of colleges.
Oh, there's fantastic people. Yeah, it's not that there's no shortage of fantastic young people out there. A place as diverse as the Custer Gallatin National Forest, the whole idea of collaboration is really fundamental to how you work with people. Collaboration doesn't mean that everyone always agrees, or that
definitely doesn't mean that. No.
Or that people come together. But what collaboration looks like if you're out on the Sioux Ranger District, I think feels very different than collaboration on the Bozeman Ranger District and engaging with the community of Bozeman and Big Sky. We've had there's collaborative efforts specifically around project level work. There's a great example I think of as collaborative work over on the outside of West Yellowstone. There's a lot of collaboration around the development of a new rail trail and a huge partnership effort to fund that. And I would put that up as just when you think about how we move work forward in the future and how we engage people, we have to have people invested in their public lands. And that means they have to get out, they have to engage, and we need that public support. I mean, there's plenty of examples of polarization, but you think about how in the world did people come together for the designation of the Wild and Scenic River in East Rosebud.
Yeah.
That's decades in the making, and then that passed in a time where there's a lot of division in society. Just recently the passage of the Great America's Outdoors Act, which of course we're still figuring out as an agency, what does that mean? What does that mean for the public? What does that mean with partners? But that's huge.
It's huge. I mean, there's not a little town in Montana that hasn't benefited from the Land and Water Conservation Fund,
right,
which is part of that. And I don't know how much access you guys have gotten, or public important tracts of land from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This was an amazing thing. Republicans and Democrats and the president all saying, hey, we want this.
Yeah, it is an amazing piece of legislation for the Custer Gallatin. Across the system, we have lands, and lands work has been really a fundamental part of our program of work. It's what people care about. So we have been great beneficiaries of Land and Water Conservation Funds in the past. And of course now it's really raised in stature across the whole system, but we certainly hope we'll be players in that in the future.
Oh, I'm sure you will, and permanent funding.
And permanent funding,
which will help give you a chance to plan a little bit. Mary Erickson, I'm honored that you came to chat with us. And I'm also very pleased that you're a forest supervisor for the Custer Gallatin with your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.